Hey, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. 3 problems we're going to solve in this debate. Sorry, I meant 2. Firstly, we're going to talk about the 0% corporate tax. That means that multinational corporations get away with murder and without having to pay any taxes, essentially due to cooperation problems. And secondly, we're going to talk about actually being able to enforce sanctions and make it into a weapon that has meaning within the international system. Before that, let's just set up the debate so everything is clear and we have a nice clean one. This body is going to be comprised of a committee of elected officials, of economists, people who are professionals. The countries will all get like one vote, and that means that, I don't know, if a majority of countries want to replace an official or have a problem with an official, then that official will be gotten rid of. And in general, if the majority of the panel wants to do something, then that is a regulation that occurs. What kinds of regulations can the system do? Firstly, all economic activity goes through this. This is country to country. This is person to person between different countries. So we're talking at the level of if Russia wants to send money to China, we're talking at the level of if, I don't know, I can see Tejas because he's got his camera open. If he wants to send money to me, if we're talking about if Google wants to send money to Apple, everything goes through the system. And secondly, they can regulate this system. So let's say somebody tries to break the system and say, I'm going to send something without taking the appropriate tax or whatever. They will literally deduct that amount of taxable money from that transfer. I don't care how they do it. They can do it using AI. They can do it using people. This is the power of fiat of what we can do. Are there any questions about this? Yes.
Yeah, so just to clarify, this is about cross-border financial transactions, right? So it can't apply to countries domestically.
Right, yeah, obviously. That's why I said you to me, because we're in different countries. It's not like me and Nomi who are in the same country. Anything that's cross-border has to go through that. Why? So I've talked about the powers. What do we think the incentives of such a body are? So firstly, because of the majoritarian way that this works, I think that it is in the interest of most countries to collaborate, and that means that we are likely to see that when the countries build agreements or work together to achieve the same things, it's unlikely that single large countries can just force other countries to do things, just like we see in the UN, that they cannot force people to do things. And we do not have the classic veto power that we would see in other places, so they actually have to do that. So even if they manage to convince other countries to take certain actions, they likely have to give them something in order to achieve that action, so it's likely to still have some kind of give and take. Secondly, we think that there are just lots of big problems that everyone suffers from, that you would enjoy having a coordinating power, but you don't have one today, and that means that you can't solve these problems. We see that with the fact that there have been some attempt to coordinate financially. It's just been impossible to do that because there has not been such a body. For example, the attempt to create a standardized tax rate. And thirdly, I think that a lot of people just want stability. It's in most countries' interest to have stability, and so they're likely to coalesce around things that bring the most stability to the financial system. What does this actually lead to? Let's talk about corporate taxes. Today, there is essentially a 0% corporate tax due to a race to the bottom. Why is this the case? MNCs are very valuable to the countries they choose to reside in because they are they provide work and intellectual property, and in general make people, and that gives money to the people within that state, and that makes them happy. However, this means that every country wants the MNC to choose to have its headquarters in their specific country. And MNCs have the ability to take their pick from all sorts of countries. What does this create? It creates a race to the bottom where every country has an interest to undercut other countries until they lower the interest rate that they demand from the corporate tax that they demand in order to attract these companies. This means that what you end up having is probably the same country that this state would have chosen anyway ends up choosing to come to the state because everyone has gotten down to 0% tax rate, and all of that money goes just to these companies' shareholders. Now, if there was coordination, then you could set some kind of regulatory tax rate that everyone has to pay, and countries would probably approach that tax rate more or less, or maybe a little bit more than that, depending on where exactly they are and how much taxes they can choose to take. But all countries would benefit from this, because there would be literally no difference except for the fact that more of the countries are getting more taxes. Why is this good? 3 reasons. Firstly, oftentimes these powerful MNCs actually abuse this money. They use the extra money they have to lobby governments in order to create structural changes that benefit them and make them either more monopolistic or lower working conditions and do literally just bad things with it. So we think them having this extra money is bad. It's often the extra money that they don't need for, I don't know, their core business, but they use it. Secondly, it's just bad redistribution. One of the reasons we have taxes is to take money from those who have wealth and redistribute it in order to allow us to achieve fair access to different goods through these companies. If these companies aren't paying taxes, we're losing access to one of the largest sources of income the country has. These are trillions of dollars annually from these companies, right? Like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, I don't know, you can name all the rest of the tech companies. These are all these kinds of companies that we're talking about. And collectively, that is literally trillions of dollars a year that is disappearing from countries. And finally, this levels the playing field significantly for a lot of these countries rather than having to go down to zero and starting giving other kinds of things. We think that this money can be used by these countries for upscaling their population, for providing social welfare, and for all sorts of other things like that, which is incredibly important. Before I go on to my point about sanctions, I'll take a POI from close. From opening. No? Okay. Sad.
So,
yeah.
So why is the debate only about MNCs and doesn't consider individual immigrants going to other countries?
I think that the individual immigrants are also important, but I think they are going to be less important just because the amount of money that we're talking about is significantly less. The total amount of money from all the individuals who work, especially because they're often low-income laborers when they're migrating and sending money back home rather than choosing to live in this area or things like that, means that we're talking about, I don't know, maybe tens of billions, possibly even 100 billion, 150 billion, but it's just peanuts compared to trillions of dollars. And so I think that it is much more meaningful, that amount of money that we're talking about. Secondly, enforcing sanctions. Listen, today one of the biggest problems with sanctions is that you can't actually enforce them because of workarounds. Other countries just buy goods, like China buys Russian oil despite the sanctions on Russia. And they do this because there are alternative banking systems. So even if you take somebody off SWIFT, they can still transfer the money and all sorts of things like that. How does this motion actually solve the problem? Well, I mean, that's pretty obvious because you can no longer transfer that money. We regulate all inter-country money that gets transferred, which makes it very, very difficult or impossible to do that. Second, but what does this actually mean? Why is this important? It helps prevent nuclear proliferation and genocides, right? Like literally, Iran and North Korea are developing these kinds of weapons which could cause the end of the world. And threat of sanctions far more real, which lowers the need for wars. Russia wouldn't have gone to war with Ukraine if they knew the threat of sanctions was actually going to destroy them. We beg you to propose.
Awesome. And we think that you get that advantage. Now we call upon the opposition.
Yeah, so give me a few seconds to set up a timer. Okay. So starting in 3, 2, 1. So the characterization we get from opening government is one that is very skewed towards this debate, because remittances go beyond just MNCs. They go beyond the individual immigrants who is going to the US because necessarily he needs money from the US to be able to cater for his communities, needs money to be able to cater for the people at homes, even if it's with things like MNCs from our side. We're going to show you how comparatively this thing is far-worse. First of all, we think that OG tends to preach a lot of impact, broad level impact, which necessarily take very huge levels to prove. We think that the problem is, what is the problem and why can't this be solved without the functioning MNCs, etc., or this the local state necessarily taxing this? Because with things like this domestic policy is one that looks like state intervening when capital is nefariously used by people, and we think that that's okay because these people are ones that give them that power in that grand scheme of things. We think that majority of the impact you are getting from OG is also contingent on whether we get buy-in from this organization in the first place. And that's the first burden we are going to prove, that why there's no buy-in in that particular institution. One, we think that necessarily states necessarily are ones that have always seen the UN as something that has been corrupt, has been hypocritical when it comes to things like economic trade, etc. Case in point is the WTO, which is now redundant. It doesn't really solve anything because when it comes to the US and China economic trade war, they literally did nothing in that regard. So it means that there's a general perception about the corruption and hypocrisy, which means that that's one mechanism for why states will not go into that in the first place. But secondly, we think that for these institutions to exist necessarily, it means that they necessarily need to be very good at they necessarily need to be very efficient at controlling these financial regulations. But we think that states necessarily rely on remittances to want to stabilize their own currency, because at some instance and point they may need to devalue their currency to make exports easier. On another world, they may need to make their currency stronger to be able to make their imports easier. We think that necessarily in a world in which companies like countries are not able to do this, because this is a blanket policy, it means that at every point in time, you necessarily have to have a one centralized currency and one centralized mode of operation. It means there's a very large disincentive for countries to be able to opt into this in the first place. We think that in of itself is relatively problematic. But more so, we think that by virtue of how people perceive bigger states like superpowers going to use this as an avenue to be able to propagate their own economic trade wars, we think that this is problematic. How would that trade war look like in the first place? We think that when it comes to US and China relations and how necessarily one state necessarily wants to control how, like, for instance, China tried to manipulate the US economy. We don't really know how that is true, but what we know is that they bought back a lot of foreign currency from the US. We think that necessarily because such states will be more based like the structure will be more based like on the economic power, the economic funding they're able to give to this, the experts they're able to have on that particular platform. Because government doesn't really show you how this structure look like. They only say that, oh, we elect officials. Those officials are ones that necessarily had to be very huge financial experts. And those financial experts are people who come from places like China. They come from the West. The ones come from developing countries because most of the financial institutions are ones that are already suffering. Because if you concede that these financial institutions are suffering, it means you can't really get good representatives from them, which means that the majority of the policy which should be passed are going to ones that are favor developed countries alone, which means one, there's no incentive for people to even come in. So in that case, taking their best case scenario, all those things happen. We think that does not happen. But moving on to taxes, because that's one argument they say that they want taxes. We think that taxes are ones that can be done on individual policy basis. If necessarily a company, like a country wants to do things like tax individuals who necessarily take their money back home, or tax MNCs who necessarily take their money back home, we think that this can be done individually. We think that case in point, Monaco, they were able to introduce the value-added tax necessarily who was able to effectively regulate this. But moving on to the argument about MNCs and how we think that this MNC argument is one that is very non-comparative. We think that for MNCs, when they are coming into developed countries, developed countries are ones that are in a state that's necessarily they want those capital the same ways, whether that capital is one that's going to be nefarious or that capital which is going to be pernicious, or they're going to, because when these MNCs come in, they're able to get in a lot of their workers. And because it's an MNC, it means they're better going to get foreign currency, which will help boost the economy. The priority of developed countries is not that, oh, this MNC is going to do environmental degradation, or this MNC is going to evade taxes. Because notice that necessarily, as opposed to other sites anyway, whether this whether these MNCs pay tax are being regulated or not, they will still opt out either ways. Because these multinational companies are more likely to be traded to places like the West. Because if, let's say, an MNC from US necessarily comes into a developed country, and China wants to necessarily say that, oh, look, your MNC is doing this in Congo. US can say that, oh, US can just come and defend and use its veto power in that particular institution, because more likely that institution is going to look like people who have the more financial capacity going to be more represented in that instance. We think that word is very problematic. We think all the impacts they preach are ones that don't exist. But moving on to more nuanced characterization of what this debate should look like, because we think the debate transcends things like MNCs and how multinational companies are able to act within states. Because I've been able to show you that irrespective of whether they put in these policies or not, these MNCs will still come. Developed countries are ones which will still want it. And because these developing countries want these MNCs and they want to be the highest bidder as opposed to the other their neighboring developing country, it means there's no incentive for them to even join this particular framework in the first place, which means that in the best case scenario, even if you get all those impacts, your impact has zero. People don't join in the first place, and that's problematically that's not solving in the first place. But we think that this debate also feeds into people who are immigrants, people who necessarily want to go out, because remittances also feed to immigrants who, because of the pressure of their homes, because of the pressure of their community, wants to go to the US to work, and as such, when they come back, they're able to they can be able to give those funds to their people. We have Sadio Mane who necessarily plays who necessarily plays football, necessarily sending his money back home to be able to help those sectors. We think that those developing countries are people who rely on these remittances, poor families, etc., which rely on that. OT tries to run away from that frame by saying that, oh, they think it's not so big. We think that because necessarily the rate of immigrants having in places like the US and the West are places which are highly increasing, which means that if you aggregate all the sum income of all those individuals, it still represents the profit that an MNC will still an MNC will still get. because it means that on the comparative, if I don't get an MNC in my state, all the workers who necessarily work for that MNC or people who would like to move to the West or move to other developed countries because that is where they can get their profits from, which means it's not totally a comparative to get all the cases to get from Prime Minister. We think that on our side, in which are able to maintain these domestic policies, in which states, if they want to tax people, they can still tax them. We think that world is a far more better world because what you get on the other side is hypocrisy. Even if they solve all the impacts, they don't show the clear agency and the clear problem we have with this current status, the current world we have in that I'm so proud to oppose.
Awesome. We thank the speaker for that one. And now we call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear what was said.
I just invited you to speak.
I still can't actually hear properly.
Can you hear me now?
Slightly better, yes.
Yes, I was just inviting you to speak, so you can start your speech whenever you're ready.
Excellent, thank you. Happy to. Great.
Awesome.
Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. A number of things I'm going to do in my speech. I'm going to directly clash with opening opposition, talk about the incentives of this body and why we think that it is likely that it is going to mostly benefit the vast majority of countries in the world, and not only the largest countries, also engaging with the comparative of the fact that countries like the US and China currently have many, many tools for dictating financial aspects of many other countries. And we think that actually we reduce this to a significant amount within our world, as do we reduce the ability of MNCs to do so. And then I'm going to weigh and explain why we think that we just achieve the most effective redistribution of wealth on a global scale and the most effective maximization of benefit for all countries, as well as actually giving the UN power to affect outcomes within the world and giving it some form of enforcement. So let's begin though with some external responses to OA. And we'll begin with this thing of, but there won't be any buy-in to this organization. A number of things on this. There's just a very clear incentive for people to buy in. As Yishai pointed out, the cooperation that we can achieve here solves a lot of the problems for countries that cannot achieve actions that they want to because they are individual actors that don't have power against larger actors. This is true for many small countries as opposed to one large country with more financial means. This is true as opposed to a large corporation. There is an incentive to join these bodies. And insofar as people think that the UN is corrupt, first I would argue that this is a UN-led organization, but still one that they are going to have a lot of ability to control and affect, and not necessarily direct product of the UN. But also I would argue that there is, to an extent, quite a lot of buy-in to the UN. The vast majority of states elect to participate within it and elect to even adhere to it and to join in UN-led accords and things like that. There is, generally speaking, on the part of most states, a desire to take part in it. Insofar as the autonomy of states for intervening within their action, I don't know why individuals within states have that much autonomy or control over the state's policy, because they don't often understand financial policy to that great of an extent to an ability to actually make this a voting issue and affect it greatly, because they often don't have a lot of political power to affect these outcomes, because they're often actually more affected by large corporations who are affecting government policies and so forth. And I just don't think that there is a huge difference in autonomy, nor do I think that it's that important a principle. I think if we just improve people's lives overall within this debate, that's more important to me than whether people consented to the UN controlling these aspects or not. Lastly, we're told that, the states can achieve this now. They can have the taxation that they want. And developing countries want these MNCs. They benefit from the MNCs being here. And that is why they elect to have different policies. But now we're forcing people on to be in the same currency or the exact same policies. That's not true. There is no part of this that makes it likely that what there's going to be a new global currency, or that every single country is to be enforced to have the exact same remittance policies. The likely scenario is that there are going to be some oversight on the minimum that you can set, or the maximums that you can set, or the who you have to give access to or who you can't give access to. That doesn't mean you dictate everything. It means that you set certain limitations. These limitations precisely serve these developing countries that want the MNCs, because we agree they should be able to attract them. But the problem is that because there is an enormous collective action problem here, because they all desperately want to attract these companies, that is the point where they are all racing to the bottom and reaching the point where they no longer make any demands of these companies and don't generate far less revenue from them than they could. The likely scenario is that even if a minimum on these taxes is set, is that still there will be countries who will have higher taxes because they can afford to, and probably Western countries will do so. But all of the developing countries competing against each other and going as low as they can now aren't going quite as low as they used to, and are just gaining more benefit than they used to in the comparative. We think that this is an enormous benefit that we create. Now, on the incentives of these body, and crucially on comparing it to alternatives that we have, because I will say that these countries are going to be abused by great powers, but today large countries can already force small countries, and they can do it a lot more easily because these small countries are not coalesced under joint policies that prevent say the US or China dictating them, changing their policies to a greater degree. We think that now these countries can threaten a response and can also change regulation in order to prevent these sorts of things, because despite the fact that the US is an actor within this committee, its relative power within the committee, given the enormous number of votes that don't belong to it, is still smaller than its relative power in one-on-one interactions with no collective action involved. We think that other bodies, A, are spread out and unsynchronized. They aren't as all incorporating, which means that their joint power is lesser, and B, they're a lot easier to co-opt and control precisely because they are smaller and have less power, because a single strong actor within them can gain control in a far more easy way, and because them competing against each other means that they're more likely to also compete for who gives them resources, who participates in them, and who gets control of them. At the end of the day, these sorts of committees would be formed in the UN and be elected, present multiple perspectives, have an ability to act collectively, and also have a lot of universal incentives, things like holding MNCs to account, things like creating regional stability and overall benefit. All of these are universal desires that all of these would like to benefit and create. Before I continue closing.
Yeah, so why would countries like Russia and China that are at high risk of having economic sanctions imposed on them opt into this, even if other countries that are worried about the corporate tax collective action problem do? Isn't it true that at least for this narrow slice of countries, they wouldn't opt into this?
So here's the thing. I think that the likelihood that they wouldn't opt in is a lot lower than the likelihood that they, in status quo, don't opt into to sanctions and to policies that are trying to be enacted or trying to work on collective action. Because at the point where there is a vast buy-in by countries into this thing, then all small countries have a huge incentive to buy in. And at the point where nearly all countries have bought into this sort of system, China and Russia have way more to lose than they do now in status quo, where there are still a fairly large proportion of countries that are willing to cooperate with them and are willing to conduct business with them without any form of regulation. So we're not saying we create a perfect system, but we think we have a lot more power than we do in the comparative. And that is why we think we gain a lot of these benefits, even if not in a total way. This isn't all or nothing. We can have it to degrees. It is a scalar impact. Now, why do we think that we do the most important thing in debate? We think this effective redistribution of wealth is a crucial thing. A, because we think it's a global obligation to countries that have been taken advantage of historically to redistribute the wealth and allow them to develop to a similar extent. We also think it's a corporate obligation on part of MNCs who have benefited off these countries to start contributing back. We also think it's the most effective way of creating stability for all, because when we contribute to all these countries to an equal extent, the likelihood of a crash, which then causes a knock-on effect, is a lot lower. We also think it's the most effective way of creating growth, because these smaller developing countries are precisely where we can maximize growth when they receive the most contribution. We think that due to all of these things, we receive maximum benefit when everybody works together and maximizes their power. Please propose.
Awesome. Prepare for that final speech. Now we call upon the deputy leader of opposition.
Hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible. Do you mind just speaking a bit louder?
All right. Few minutes. Just want to arrange my sheets. All right, so I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. So again, like I expect DPM to come and do better when it comes to case repair, because as you are giving a blanket policy or giving necessarily an organizational like framework, you want to form an international organization, there's a broad discussion that must be engaged when it comes to things about buying, because you need buying from states to be able to be effective as an institution. Otherwise, you are just going to replicate all the many failures you've had in the past necessarily, because we think the UN has tried to implement a lot of economic policies, from economic, sub-economic development schemes. The US, like i.e., we have things like the World Trade Organization, we have like places like the World Bank, which necessarily are very defunct as they stand now. They're not necessarily doing what they aim to do. For instance, the World Bank was there to come and help, being a replica of BRI, in which necessarily they help like developing nations' investments. As it stands now, it's not doing what it wants, which means that necessarily what it was like meant for, which means that necessarily there's an overarching apathy which exists with developing nations to be able to opt into this. Because I tell you that necessarily of the incentive that they still have for these MNCs to come, the perception they have is they get by opening their borders to these MNCs. We think on their side they don't get those incentives, because it's not just about whether necessarily this like international organization can actually do what it seeks to do. The discussion becomes, what do people perceive these organizations to be? If people perceive this in a bad light, it means you don't get all the benefits they preach on their word. We think it's slightly problematic. But moving on to incentives, and because in my first speech I told you how necessarily one, developing nations will not do this and how this affects local workers, etc. But secondly, this speech I'm going to tell you how necessarily this developed nations also have literally no incentive to engage in this UN-led organizations. First case, and that is necessarily about other states like China and Russia, because we think that such states necessarily are ones that the organization necessarily is built upon to curtail things like predatory mechanisms by MNCs, which means that states like China, states like Russia, which necessarily do predatory mechanisms such as dumping a lot of their goods in foreign countries, necessarily evading a lot of taxes. It means that such individuals, because they are going to be in another international-led organization by the US, which they've already had economic trade disputes with. But secondly, they've also evaded a lot of UN-led sanctions against them. Because notice that if your word is supposed to work, it means the sanctions you're also giving to this state should also work. One, they have no incentive to opt into this, because they think that there's a better mechanism which they can do, probably still going on things like BRI. But two, because necessarily such states have already been we don't want to fix sanctions with you anymore, they will not opt into this. Notice, these are the main big guys you want to go after. If they don't opt into this, your utility is zero on that particular aspect. But let's engage the Western and Europe guys who they claim that they'll be happy to do this. Three things and why they won't opt into this. One, notice that most of these MNCs they preach about, a majority of them also comes from these Western institutions, which means that the Westerners also directly benefit from MNCs coming in. They benefit if Amazon comes into, say, Congo and takes necessarily their cobalt, probably any tech industry goes to Congo, takes their cobalt and uses them, because they're able to benefit from there. They're able to get those natural resources, to be able to advance their currency. They're able to beat China when it comes to the tech trade war. It means that the larger incentive for them is to be able to allow, co-opt developing nations into their world, which means that zero incentive also lies for the US to be able to do this in that grand scheme of things. We think that lack of incentive is sometimes problematic. But secondly, on local immigrant workers, because remittances, as I said, move beyond the discussion of just MNCs. They look at people who necessarily, immigrants who move to those sectors to be able to find work to do. Because notice that I characterize you that if an MNC does not exist in your state, the number of people who want to move to US or move to China to get trade, profits or to work, are going to be the same number of people who equally work for the MNCs in that regard. Which means that in a world in which the money they work for is not going back to their communities, because this is also the principle. These people worked hard for their money. They had hard-earned monies. Why should an international organization essentially control the money, hard-earned money they work? Because the regulation is more likely to go like this. One, there'll be a significant tax on these monies. Secondly, they're going to be blocking certain transactions during certain times. These people will need to send the money, which means that individuals cannot send money when there's an emergency at their homes. We think this is problematic on their side, which means that one, you disincentivize these immigrant workers from moving into their state. Why is this bad? Notice the West currently is one that needs a lot of immigrant workers, because it's losing a lot of its skilled workers when it comes to population, because there's a declining population when it comes to these developed countries. Why is this true? Because of things like the decline of pervasive culture and religion, which makes birth a good thing. Two, there's automation and the major layoffs within the tech industry, like Twitter, Meta, Nvidia. Three, there's pro-abortionist policies. There's also the factionalization of having less kids. Moreover, there's also birth control policies like the one-child policies, which means that the Western countries are in need of an active labor workforce. In a world in which necessarily developed countries developing they create this financial institution, it creates a perception that necessarily people cannot necessarily send money to their homes when they need to, which means that overarchingly, necessarily, it becomes a problem. How does this problem look like? It means that because these immigrant workers will also want to go to the US and get money to come and feed their families, it means that because they want to evade all these sanctions and evade all these taxes, they are more likely to evade like tax border laws. They're more likely to go into that state as temporary workers, and that becomes even a shitty economic condition for them, because it means that they now have to work in very abandoned factories, work in very shitty jobs, because necessarily they are afraid that if they go and work in these high-profile institutions, their taxes are ones that are going to be significantly taxed. They don't want that as a result. Even if their taxes will be significantly taxed, the perception around it is that one, they cannot be able to send money on time when they need to. Accounts people are having issues with PayPal, because with PayPal, sometimes you can't even send money when you want to on time because they want to limit the transactions you have. People don't want much of this on a very large scale and on a very gargantuan scale. They want in a world in which you can be able to send money to their families, etc. But we think that this also becomes a problem for the US and the Westerners, because it means they can't have all the cheap labor and all the workers they get from immigrant workers, because immigrant workers necessarily would prefer to necessarily work at a cheaper rate. On their side, it means that these immigrant workers will also want to demand for more, because they are afraid that if they don't demand for more necessarily, they won't be able to get enough money to send back to their families, which means that overarchingly there's also zero incentive which exists on the US to be able to, the Western countries to be able to do this. On any international organization platform, let's assume that in the best case scenario, this is effective and that they're able to effect a good policy. In the best case scenario, you still don't get those incentives from people, and people necessarily will not opt into that particular instance. Even if you get that incentive, it means that because states will necessarily also want to with time change their policies, with time change how the MNCs operate, it means that within time this is going to be likely defunct and will just be like the WTO, the World Bank, which necessarily does not have enough buying as it stands. The question is, they need to defend why World Bank and World Trade Organization is still there but is not doing its work. Never been so proud to win this.
Awesome. We thank that speaker for that fine speech. And that brings us to the end of the opening bench. We call upon number 4 for today's closing half. Here.
Hey everyone, just want to confirm, am I audible and hopefully visible?
Yes, you are.
Oh, okay. Shit. It's been nonsense. So sorry, my video was acting up, so I just said turn it off. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. So panel, I'm going to start by just explaining the origins of where the problem in today's debate exists. So if you're Nigerian or you live in any African or third world country, you notice a bunch of things. One is that it's ridiculously hard to both get money into Nigeria and send money out. And depending on the means through which you use, the value of the money you are sending could either double or half. What does this look like? One is that because normative or orthodox transporting or transfer companies like PayPal and Stripe don't particularly go to Nigeria, you usually have to bounce your transactions through multiple apps to get it into Africa or into any of these third world countries in the first place, which means that you're paying a ton of percentages across them. But most importantly, a lot of these nations have pegged currencies due to a bunch of chaos that's going on within those countries right now. And because of that, for example, in Nigeria, the pegged currency is 440 naira to $1, but in the real market, it's about 800, which is almost twice the amount. It's absolutely chaotic and it's really messy. The outcome of that is very simple, right? Is that it's ridiculously difficult to send money because the paperwork and the bouncing is really chaotic. But most importantly, depending on how you send it, your value could have. This means one, is that if you're an investor looking to invest in Africa or invest in third world countries with similar problems, you find it very hard to bring money to those economies or bring money to those particular spaces because you're afraid that your money is half or most of your money's value would get lost in just simply transactions and transfers, which means that when you have external foreign competitors also asking for that same money or that same investment, you automatically prioritize them over. Second of all, if you are a local student trying to send money across, for example, paying school fees of children, this becomes really chaotic and difficult to do, which is why tons of students from African origin, even though like they have wealthy parents, cannot afford to pay like school fees abroad simply because the transfers are hectic and are borderline insane. What this means is simple. At the point in time when Nigeria and a bunch of other third world countries want to get like tons of like investment into their country and tons of wealth into their country, but in the same vein, a lot of these countries also have foreign investors that want to invest very strongly into these particular countries like Africa and third world because they have like a lot of potentials and a lot of room for growth and development. And they also have enough lobbying power within their countries to make these particular dealings and business agreements possible. There is a unique incentive that exists on both sides, both on the side of like the local governments and the like third world countries to drive this investment and drive these particular businesses so they can make money and then they can pull money to develop their countries, at least at the very least, even in the case of corruption, steal the money. But also on the side of like local of external foreign businesses and investors that want to be able to bring money in and inevitably invest in these fertile grounds, take advantage of new opportunities and grow their economy. What that means that there is mutual incentive on both sides. This intuitively responds to what exists on opening opposition side, but brings out a unique impact that comes out of this policy, right? So primarily what this policy would look like because of defined by this unique incentive is one, a standardization of the remittance system, how like there'll probably be countries or systems that can easily send money from one spot to the other at fixed rates in a way that is trackable, is fairly objective. Why is this particularly beneficial? One, because investments become faster, efficient, and a whole lot more stable. Why? Because at the point in time where you can transfer at a fixed rate that you can understand, you can explain, and wouldn't end up halving the amount of money you're transferring across systems, you are able to inevitably make sizable investments within particular third world countries without fears and without worries. What this means is one, you're able to drive economic growth to a sizable extent or to a sizable degree because you can then like spend money to these particular countries and do it efficiently without any worries and without any sizable problems or without any sizable challenges, which we think matters a lot in today's debate in class to driving economic growth. But second of all, at the point in time where you're also able to take that money out efficiently, you are not able to like worry about not being able to get your profit in a fair and effective way. So we think that itself is another impact that exists on driving economic growth. But onto our second extension, right? And I think this is to some extent a much more valuable extension. It's with regards to remittances, especially from local workers and migrant workers and why they matter. Two things. One is that local remittances actually form a sizable amount of tons of economy. So for economies like the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and like Zimbabwe, I think to a very large extent, statistically, transactions and remittances form over 20% of what their revenue looks like, especially because of how weak their currencies can sometimes be in comparative to like the dollar or the pound, where a lot of their like expatriates go to work. The outcome of this is actually fairly simple, right? Is that on a monetary value, it matters. But most importantly, why else does it matter? It's because of the nature of the people that are transferring this money and the nature of the people that are receiving this money. One, we think they're a very, very vulnerable demographic, right? With regards to the fact that they are minority groups that have left their comfort zone where they have a community of people around them to go abroad in a space that is usually toxic, where they are not welcome and where they are exploited for their labor, to particularly work and till and toil the land and work in probably below subpack environments just to raise money back to get to their families. But worse off, their families in many instances even live in even worse off conditions because they are significantly poorer, have less access to particular relevant goods, less access to water, even basic necessities of life, and inevitably depend on the money that they get from from their workers or their family members abroad to survive, or at the very least, fashion out some decent chance of maintaining a decent or at least a dignifying life. Why is this particular context crucial? Because at the point in time where like obstructions and borders exist towards remittances and how these structures function and how they happen, it automatically becomes ridiculously problematic. One, because you're taking money out of the poorest and most endangered demographics, but at the same time, you're pure. Oh shit, time has gone. So you take money out of the poorest and most endangered demographics, and you inevitably particularly harm poor people because of how expensive these things are. So what happens is that these remittance borders end up further lowering the amount of money that poor people are able to access, by virtue of that, making their lives significantly worse, or at least sizably a lot more problematic, but at the same time, taking money from the hard-earned sweat of immigrants that go abroad and work really, really hard to maintain these systems, while at the same time harming a sizable portion of these particular countries' economies, we think that is on net bad. The comparative where you have a solved solution or a stable economic system is one where this money is transferred efficiently, in one where this money is transferred in a way that even their poor local literate family members can easily understand and get access to their money without being exploited, and one where the economies and the local businesses themselves and the country itself can directly benefit. We stand for a world that creates economic growth for local government, for international business people at the same time, while creating fair, respectable working conditions and earning conditions for both remote workers and external migrants at home and abroad. Very proud to propose.
Awesome. We thank that speaker for that fine speech. And now we call upon the opposition.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're welcome.
POIs in the chat exclusively, please. I'm going to make a single argument in the speech about why their side strips first world capital away from the countries that need the investment the most. That's going to be both new arguments as well as a bunch of mechanization of opening opposition's case. Before created, I want to address their claim that the standardization of remittance systems, making them more efficient and transferring them at a fixed rate, can substantially reduce the costs on migrants who are struggling to send remittances back home. They name, for example, really high rates in countries like Nigeria. There are two problems with this argument. First, they don't explain why this international body is likely to aim to reduce transfer fees of remittances. They merely say that they support this happening. But I actually think there are good reasons to think that this international body that, as I'm going to explain in a moment, will likely be captured by the first world, doesn't want to reduce the transfer fees of remittances so much. The most important reason is because the countries that most experience large amounts of remittances out of them are also experiencing a weakening of their domestic currency. For example, if an Indian migrant wants to send remittances back home to India, it is likely they're sending that money in dollars and the money is being converted in rupees. If that's happening at a sufficient value, then the dollar is likely to depreciate against the rupee and indeed against most global currencies. America doesn't want that because a lot of American investors hold cash in dollars or hold things like dollar-denominated debt or want to buy imports from abroad at cheap costs, and all of that becomes substantially harder if the dollar is weaker. Second of all, because transfer fees decrease naturally when you have access to the private sector. Now, they name the transfer fees are high in sub-Saharan Africa, but they don't tell you the reason. The biggest reason is because telecom companies historically monopolized things like financial transfer applications, and the fact that they had ties to the state meant it was possible for them to jack prices up. But an increasing trend is as foreign financial technology companies, as well as domestic ones, see the possibility for substantial amounts of growth in the sector because migration away from the continent and away from developing countries more generally is increasing. They enter the market and offer things like economies of scale that are able to lower the cost of transfer payments. For example, while Nigeria still has these problems, Senegal doesn't, because companies like Sendwave have produced economic value of 1% of Senegal's GDP by facilitating both international and domestic financial transactions at extraordinarily low cost. If anything, in the long term, the cost of financial transfers increases on their side because fees can decrease without standardization if you open up these markets to enter them, but only have the specialization for one individual market, because they will break into the market, they will offer substantial amounts of capital, and they will offer economies of scale. Consider, for example, that the majority of the top 10 fastest growing startups on the entire continent are fintech startups, and that's for a reason. Let's get to our extension. The rest of my rebuttal to GovBench is integrated. Why does their side strip first world capital away from countries that need the investment the most? The first thing I want to observe in this speech is that first world countries are likely to have substantial power over this institution. Opening opposition asserts this. I'm going to prove it. There are 4 structural reasons why. 1, because UN votes are often a proxy for geopolitical alignment. So a small island country generally wants to be favoring and the UK, and therefore they face substantial implicit pressure to make their UN votes or mold them in the interest of those states. Second, it's pretty plausible to buy votes in the UN with really small amounts of foreign aid. In fact, the reason American foreign aid correlates almost nothing whatsoever with the poverty of the country, that consistently shows that the US literally uses foreign aid to buy votes. Why else do you think there are random small Pacific Island countries voting in favor of Israel in the institution based on funding for this institution? So OGOE asserts that the votes are going to be one vote, one country. They don't explain why this is the case. And in fact, the precedent, when you look at institutions like the IMF, is that when you set up into word things like international enforcement, more weight in votes. And the countries that are likely to want to send so much money in enforcing this and have the capacity to are first world countries. Is because the creation of this institution is often lobby remittances on their side exist within the first world. So India doesn't have a large amount of remittances escaping it, but the US does and wants the ability to tax those transactions or prevent offshoring. So a lot of the collective action problem OG describes affect the US far more, and it's the one setting up this institution. That's the first piece of framing I want to give you. The second piece of framing I want to give you is about opt-ins. Now, opening opposition argues that countries will opt out, but the only reason is you view the UN as corrupt without really giving you an argument for why. And I think OG responds to this quite persuasively when they say that countries don't want to be stuck in the race to the bottom of low corporate taxes and therefore have incentives to opt into this institution. I do think, however, that some countries will opt out. Two types in particular. One, countries that face substantial risk of economic sanction. Economic sanctions crush your economy way more than the marginal ability to tax companies a bit more or a bit less. So Russia will never opt in. Second, tax havens. The entire comparative advantage of tax havens is near zero taxes. They benefit from the ability to engage and participate and win the race to the bottom, so they continue to keep taxes low. With this context in mind, there are three ways that investment does not flow into the parts of the world that need it the most, i.e. first world countries. What are these reasons? First world countries push these regulations to intentionally ensure large companies stay domestic. I want you to remember that the tax problems that opening government identifies are fairly marginal. Most countries have signed an agreement to ensure that the global corporate minimum tax is 15% already. This debate is about the margins where it increases furthermore. However, what do first world countries do? They want to avoid their financial capital and their companies from going abroad, displacing local investment. Therefore, they intentionally place substantial regulations on international remittances in order to prevent investors from investing in bonds that have higher real interest rates in developing countries and then bringing back the money with them while capital is used to finance developing countries. They want the capital within their overwhelmingly restrictive regulation. And it can only do this when it can break apart this collective action problem, because otherwise Ireland will simply not do this and companies will set up there instead. Second, because there are likely to be substantial regulations on remittances by individuals. Open opposition just asserts this. Let me give you the mechanism for why individual remittances, even if small scale, will be regulated. Because, as I explained, even individual remittances place a cost on your local currency by depreciating it, meaning you actively regulate or heavily tax transactions by individual migrants struggling to send money home. Third, this money goes into small tax havens. Small tax havens don't have things like a labor force. Their main comparative advantage is lower taxes. If the taxes in India become much higher, you go to a tiny tax haven and invest your money there instead. That's terrible because these countries have much lower populations, very proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for that fine speech, and now we call upon the government rep here.
Yo. I'll start in just a second. I'll take a POI for opening if they want. I'll take a POI from anyone. You can just drop it in the text space, and if I haven't taken it by 5:30, feel free to unmute and just send it through to me. Just a quick word. Nice to be in a final. It's always a lovely feeling, but it feels even better when you're here with a friend. So shout out to Yafa, one of the best upcoming voices in terms of African debaters. It's been a fun count, man. So thank you for the time, for the partnership. Been lovely. All right, cool. I'm gonna get right into it. I think, if I'm honest, there's been a pretty disingenuous response to the extension delivered by the closing government. And I think I just want to do a level of like contextualization that maybe just solves for some of the very stock argumentation of like currency depreciation, first world incentive to maintain market value. I want to note that explicitly, majority of the countries who benefit from phenomenal like migrant workforces or places that are highly developed or highly economically powerful, places like Russia, places like Germany, places like the USA. This means that yes, they probably have some incentive to maintain currency value. I want to know that they create some specific and they accrue some level of specific and amazing benefit from these people. That is to say that these people are sending a negligible amount of dollars to a country, but that those dollars have a specifically massive amount of capacity for change in these countries. It's why, for instance, 1 in 9 families in places like Zimbabwe are bankrolled by global remittances, often sent through things like the currency, sent through things like the dollar. Importantly, this means that the member of opposition's very unreasonable frame of like, for some reason, these countries have such a massive onus of currency depreciation that they're likely to not allow these things to happen in force. Again, I think this is just a bit silly, right? I think the economic trade-off is here is that you have certain jobs which your local population is unlikely to do, and therefore these are oftentimes like jobs that these people are not open to. It's often service industry and or like I think it's like in like, for instance, within the context of like the US, or like, for instance, like positions like nurses that have zero capacity to solve for locally. This means that you're probably willing to accrue some level of personal but like statewide harm if you're able to do this. I mean, I think this solves for the fact that like these things don't happen on like in the first instance in terms of currency depreciation, because there's such a massive value to these existence of these people in these nation states. I want to then frame the capacity for specific change that remittance has, and I want to note how in status quo this is severely kneecapped by the lack of regulation. IAFA tells you specifically that something like 85% in most instances of money sent never reaches these places because they're locked out of these systems, and they're locked into these systems of transfer. This is important because even with that really small amount that goes through, people are able to bankroll their lives and arguably bankroll entire sections of these nations. This is important because it illustrates the value of importance that I think you need to weigh this debate on. I think the rest of the House, and this is really weird because I think somehow we're in line with opening opposition and somehow CEO is in line with our opening government. I want to be really, really clear here. The shift here is not necessarily in the onus or ability to tax things like corporate governance. I want to know that the closing opposition literally says that, like, for instance, these are relatively set at things like 15%. And I don't think this necessarily is a stabbing of our opening government. We're on the same boat, going to the same place. We're just using a different route. This is important to note within the context of the debate, because I think it means that the transfer fees decrease that they say happens in closing opposition. And I think this is where we have to like question some really, really stark things that come out here. It's like there are existing small scale alternatives that happen in certain countries like Senegal. These have the equivalent capacity to take money across borders. I want to note that most of these services are intra-Africa services. Oftentimes they're limited to certain geographic areas. That means most people who send remittances don't use these services, but more than that, they often have significant monetary caps. They're not specifically allowed to send over a certain amount. And this means that, yes, of course, or specifically within the scope or solve for the problems that we have here. This is important because the main mechanism of sending money is things like Western Union, which is such a massively coercive system. I want to note then that this solves for the buy-in problem that the entirety of the opposition bench has with our side. They say that there's no incentive for people to buy in at the UN. And I want to note, this is a bit silly, right? I know the UN in some instances is a really bad place, and oftentimes is arguably culpable of inaction. But I want to note specifically when it comes to ability to regulate and policy decisions around the developing world, they've been really good with implementation of policy through things like UN Habitat. This means that these countries have an incentive because they have a global gap in workforce that is being sustained by these people at almost no cost to these countries. The only thing that they need to opt into, and arguably, again, a lot of the time, these are vanguard democracies, like people who claim to be vanguard of democracies. A lot of the time, this means that these people are very willing to opt into very reasonable regulation. I want to note that this probably incentivizes individuals to come here. This means that, for instance, if Germany does it and the USA doesn't, people and migrants are incentivized to go to other nation states. This means that, again, if this is a race to the bottom, it's a good one. It means that they're likely to create some significant level of buy-in. This is really important because it solves for a really underspoken about thing in the world. I want to note that the capacity to illustrate and create some level of corporate tax lobbying on the opposition side of the House, and specifically in terms of the closing opposition, is something that's very, very difficult to manage, especially in terms of the way they frame it around investment. I want to be clear. Yes, there are definitely ways in which these countries, the first world nations, have incentivized these sort of NMCs to be border bound within the states. But uniquely, this doesn't solve, this hasn't necessarily solved or resulted in a lack of investment in these nation states. I want to note that these nation states oftentimes are so valuable in terms of economic opportunity that even with those restrictions, they find ways to actually access these markets through either subsidiaries or specifically or through specific subsidiaries, or oftentimes non-bounded funding. This is important because it develops local capacity which means I don't think they get an exclusivity here, right? I think they say that there's some mechanism of removing of this, but I don't think this investment flow decrease is significant given the economic scale of benefit. I want you to note that oftentimes economies specifically here within the context of the actors that the closing opposition wants to speak about are the most important in terms of gaining some level of change. I'd love to take a POI quickly before I move on.
Okay,
from anyone.
okay. Look, Western Union is $5 billion institution. Are they profiting from your policy or not profiting from your policy?
I listen again. I think regardless, this is the weird thing, right? I don't think they're actually profiting that much. I think they're just profiting a little bit because they're a greedy company and there's a need for regulation. However, I think their slight profit is eliminating a massive potential of amount of money and change-making potential. I want to be clear, the power of remittance in creating social and economic change within these developing nations is near untapped. I want you to note investment specifically doesn't accrue to most people in these nations, like to create a tangible benefit to these lives. However, panel, the pound transfer or the dollar transfer into these nation states. I have to tell you about the Naira conversion rate. In South Africa, a pound is 21 Rand. That means at a point where I send a few pounds, I'm sending hundreds of rands. This is important because I think it illustrates and weighs out against our opening government, because I think they say some magic stuff about how they get taxation, and I believe in their ability to do it. But I think significantly more valuable to note is that these things have market incentives to taper out anyway. What doesn't exist is a market incentive to cater for individuals who've been fundamentally framed out of these systems, locked out of economic development, and subsequently are contributing a valuable service to nations without any specific economic checkback. I think at a point where I've proved the opening opposition's burden of how remittances, yes, are valuable, but we improve them by giving them regulation in a system that has been relatively coercive and solve for the opening government's specific level of like benefit that they want to accrue. I think the closing opposition's failure to contextualize past very unrealistic and very small scale responses in terms of some economies of scale and I don't know, some level of investment drop off. The most important change is to an individual who can pay for their ability or for their family to accrue some level of safety. And this is the most important thing that you ought to consider within the scope of this round. Thank you very much. And it's been a lovely tournament. Thank you.
Awesome. We thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now we call upon the opposition rep to close this debate to the entire house. Here.
I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thanks everyone. I hope I see you at structural reasons in a couple of weeks. Let me just get my timer out and we are ready to go. I honestly can't tell if a bunch of the judges' analysis stock or not, but I think if teams in this round are basically losing to generic stock arguments, that's pretty much their own problem. Now, let's kind of engage and go over the things that are important for this round. The crucial thing that is important for this round is who is going to be influencing this institution, right? Because whoever proves that, then the incentive mechanisms for these particular actors are crucial into proving whether this is going to have more good or bad outcomes. We are the only team in this round that have given you structural reasons of the why this is going to be dominated by particular actors, e.g. in this case, first world actors, such as the US, such as China, etc., etc. Why is this important? It's important because then the way that you should evaluate this round is by who is able to prove to you better that these incentives will lead to better or worse policies that affect the important actors in the round. Now, let's look at this firstly on remittances for people. And I think this is very important. They just tells you that there is an active incentive of these particular countries because of how their currencies are influenced to make sure that remittances are fairly limited and stay the same. What the response that we get to this is, at best, completely mitigatory. There is CG never gives us why this incentive does not exist, and at best they tell us, oh, but even if they lose this particular profit, they will still likely basically benefit from the large influx of migration. But the problem with this argument is twofold. Firstly, why is this the main reason why people migrate? Yes, the ability to send money to your family is good, but I'm unsure to what extent a lot of the people that migrate to these countries are going to do this. E.g., even if now a bunch of people that only go to the US to send money back home are not going, there's probably as many willing to go there just to have a better lives for themselves and their family. But second of all, this is factually incorrect. A lot of these first world countries have very strict migration policies exactly because there is a huge influx of people. There is no structural analysis provided that this is actively going to change. And I do think it's absolutely ridiculous to come out and say, oh yes, now people are going to stop going to the US from countries that are literally ravaged by war or by drug cartels or things like that. I think on both sides, the US is going to have a bunch of people coming in and they don't care about the extra people. But I'd like to posit another response to this. They say Western Union, but I agree, Western Union, but. So are Western Union's incentives aligned with the US state? Yes, because of the just analysis. Here is another response to this. Western Union is a $5 billion institution that pays taxes where? In the fucking United States. Actively, basically, crippling down this business hurts not only your tax income from this institution, but also all of the people that work for the institutions, because you're effectively on their side of the house going to pass a policy that destroys the business model of such a huge financial institution. Second of all, these companies, exactly because they're $5 billion institutions, even if the US is fucking crazy to act against the interests of their own budget and their own people, they're going to be lobbied against that. Western Union is going to lobby against lifting these particular regulations and might even lobby for increasing these particular regulations because they can essentially further take advantage of this profit. Why? Because, you know, they have a bunch of money. They pay a bunch of politicians for their campaigns so that they get elected. This is how fucking lobbying works. So if anything, by changing the status quo so that the US has even more dominance, we are making it even worse for these particular countries, basically flipping the closing government argument. And we never get responses to a just analysis to why these problems that currently exist have structural incentives for people to solve them by a competitive market, by doing a bunch of products. Here is another reason. You can even basically transfer money by cryptocurrencies and stuff like that, which is another option if you're that particularly desperate. So before I continue, I'm going to take opening government.
Yeah, luckily, we already explained that due to the majoritarian nature of this committee, it is unlikely that it will go against what is in the interest of most undeveloped countries, and there are more of them than there are developed countries. More than that, we also weighed the size of the impact below what you're talking.
Like, give me one POI. You can't give me 3 POIs. You should have done it in your speech, the comparative. I mean, look, what we're saying is that these particular countries are either going to get fucked because you're fucking up a small tax haven country that has a bunch of population that doesn't have like an active industry, energy-wise, manufacturing or things like that. The only thing that they can like basically give to the world in order to like actually sustain themselves as a country and their population is by becoming tax havens, especially if you're like a small island that doesn't have a bunch of population and things like that. You're actively fucking over these people and crumbling their economics. I'm talking about like millions and millions of people around the world. But I think secondly, and I think this is crucial, opening government gives you incentive mechanisms as to why, like, basically saying big these first world countries can fuck you up smaller countries right now anyway. But that's untrue, because if you like as the US come out today and like actively restrict trade with manufacturers such as Vietnam or things like that. This is going to send a huge problematic in terms of your predictability. And this is a huge reason why a lot of these companies exist in the US in the first place, because they are free market oriented and because they support these corporations and the trade with themselves. So it's a huge disinterest and a bad messaging if they continue doing that, meaning comparatively, you get much more ability for these FDIs to go to the developing world. So fucking proud to oppose this motion.
We thank that speaker for that fine speech, and that brings us to the